Even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield or something.
You know, is there any kind of evidence in the universe that could make, I mean, if the stars lined up to spell, Peter, please believe in me, it's about time.
I put it down to madness.
You put it down, so...
To personal madness.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like, Peter, that there's no evidence that would persuade you away from atheism.
Well, to be honest, I think that's probably the case.
This video is about evidence and about atheism. It has 3 different videos that I'm going to feature, and the point of this video is really to hold a mirror up to leading atheist claims, and in particular, Richard Dawkins is featured in this video, who both insist upon evidence, claims that his entire worldview is based on evidence, and then in an ironic fashion, we'll see how he doesn't actually live that through. With that being said, we're going to dive into the first clip now, which is a portion of a conversation that he had with Peter Boghossian. Let's do it.
As religiosity decreased, deranged woke beliefs increased. Do you think that as one religion fades, another, like default is the belief state for humans, they just have to believe something, and as the old religion fades, a new one has to come in?
Yeah. Gullibility expands to fill the vacuum.
Exactly.
Something. Yeah.
Precisely.
I suppose that's right. I hadn't really thought of it before, but it sounds plausible to me. I think G.K. Chesterton, who was a very religious man,
Right.
said when people stop believing in God, they believe in anything.
Okay, now what's interesting here is that they are basically rubbing up against the whole gender, transgender topic, and they're going to use a story here about finding skeletons to show the biological makeup of the skeletons as a way of getting at the idea of someone who's totally closed-minded or someone who simply cannot face evidence that goes against their a priori belief. Pay attention to this, and then we're going to then show how this inverts itself or becomes extremely ironic in a second, but let's dive in.
We did this video, and one of the people said that there's no difference between natal men and natal women. They're identical. And if you look at the bones, if you look at the skeletons of natal women and natal men, you couldn't tell the difference. You want
Well, I mean, archaeologists can tell by they're digging up bones that have been dead for tens of thousands of years.
Right. So I unfortunately, this conversation was off camera, but I said to this guy, I said, listen, let's say that we get 10 skeletons right here. We have 10 skeletons and we do a double blind. We find, paleontologists, we find whoever would be a bona fide expert in this. And if all 10 of these people could correctly identify each time with a very small margin of error, would you be willing to change your mind and say, yes, there's a difference between male and female skeletons? And he said no. And I said, well, why not? Because that would be like the gold standard for evidence. And he said, because it's not possible. And I said, okay, well, let's just hypothesize. This is a hypothetical. And I found, and I'm wondering if you found this too.
Well, not possible. What do you mean by not possible?
Well, that's what I said.
And you get these experts and you give them these skeletons and you get them to...
Double blind, so they don't know which skeleton is which. He said it's not possible for them to tell the difference between male and female.
He's prejudging the experiment before you do the experiment.
And I said, well, just like hypothetically, let's just say hypothetically, the expert would you be willing to change your mind? And he said no. And the thing that
is a very revealing answer.
So that was going to be my question to you. So I found that often the people who stand on the extreme lines, strongly disagree, strongly agree, they have an inability to imagine things. They have an inability to entertain hypothetical.
This idea about being able to entertain a hypothetical is what some people call open-mindedness, being willing to follow the evidence where it leads as opposed to having a predetermined response to any evidence. In a second here, we're going to show 2 examples, one of Richard Dawkins and one of Peter Atkins, ironically demonstrating this very thing. I want to really quick take this opportunity to also address something. Here's a picture of me and my brother at about 10 years old. Some of you might laugh at this and also at the idea of me and my brother being competitive about fishing, which we were. So now it's funny because my brother and I are both adults and living in different states, but we are still able to connect around fishing through an app called Fishing Clash. This was free for us to download on iOS and Android, so it makes it easy for us to play together. It's cool because you get to fish in exotic locations around the world. You get to catch and learn about different species. You get to use a bunch of cool tackle and gear, like I mentioned, and you get to compete with other people playing the game. So it makes it fun, and also as far as video games go, very connective. So use my code and you get a free rod, you get a mythical lure, and you get a bunch of different accessories that kind of help get you started in the game. If you haven't downloaded Fishing Clash yet, give it a go. It's, like I said, free to download for Android and iOS. Find a fishing buddy, wet a line, as they say in the South. Now, with that being said, let's hold the mirror up and see what we see.
What would it take for you to believe in God?
Well, I used to say it would be very simple. It would be, the second coming of Jesus, or a great big, deep, booming bass Paul Robeson voice saying, "I am God and I created." But I was persuaded mostly by actually Steve Zara, who's a regular contributor to my website, richarddawkins.net. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield or something. He made the point that a supernatural explanation for anything is incoherent, that it just doesn't sort of... It doesn't add up to an explanation for anything.
So what would persuade you?
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would, which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. The trouble is I can't think what that evidence would look like.
Okay, now so that you don't think I'm just picking on Dawkins here is Peter Atkins being asked a very similar question.
Some people might accuse you of being so committed to atheism that you'd never be willing to countenance any evidence that might lend support to a creator behind the universe. So I'm just interested, what sort of evidence could science or the physical universe present to you that would make you think, actually, that is evidence that there's a mind behind this?
I find that a very difficult question. If I were looking in the Bible for evidence, heaven forbid, I would expect to see maybe increase in entropy is equal to Q reversible divided by temperature. And that is
if there was literally an equation in the Bible,
equation
like
in
that.
the Bible, rather than all this wishy-washy,
Okay.
Elastic writing that it pervades.
All right. So if there was something like that they discovered in the Bible,
then I'd think it was
you'd
probably a
that-
forgery.
that- well, exactly. The problem is, would it actually make you?
No.
I mean, is there anything from is there any kind of evidence in the universe that could make? I mean, if the stars lined up to spell Peter, please believe in me, it's about time.
I put it down to madness.
You put it down. So
To personal madness.
right.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like, Peter, that there's no evidence that would persuade you away from atheism.
Well, to be honest, I think that's probably the case.
in that sense,
Wow.
do you even have an evidence-based view if you're actually committed to atheism a priori?
Well, I'm predicting that there will be no such evidence. That's not quite the same thing as being committed to it a priori. I can't.
But you said there's
envisage-
no evidence that would persuade you otherwise.
I think it's much more likely that I would have gone mad than such evidence would have been provided.
And this now gets to an additional claim that is often made by atheists, that is that the only type of evidence that is valid or legitimate evidence is evidence of a scientific nature that can be repeated, that can be studied in a lab, which we're going to see now why that itself is a form of reductionism, a bad epistemology or way of knowing, because it is, again, extremely restrictive and it limits one from knowing things outside of that limitation. So I'm going to pitch now to a claim from Trent Horn talking about Matt Dillahunty, who kind of famously makes this claim versus evidence distinction. But in this clip, Trent Horn exposes what is, again, wrong and reductionistic about that particular way of viewing things and why. So let's go ahead and play that clip now.
If Dillahunty is only saying that claims are not proof, or that merely claiming something happened doesn't always prove it happened, well, then he's right. People make false claims, but people also make true claims. And here's what's important. The claims themselves are what lead us to believe a statement is true, which means the claims are evidence. And in some cases, the convergence of claims even rises to the level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For example, if three strangers in a public park all independently went to the police and said that Smith indecently exposed himself, most people would consider that proof Smith committed the crime, even apart from other facts that would confirm this unrepeatable event, like surveillance footage. That's why we can make a case for something like Christ's resurrection based on claims from people like Paul, who saw the risen Jesus, and the gospel authors who knew the disciples. Intersecting claims from sources that have nothing to gain and everything to lose from making a false claim become powerful evidence that an event happened. But in this video, I'm not making a case for the resurrection. I'm just refuting Dillahunty's assertion that claims are not evidence, because he often uses this statement to undercut any possible evidence for the resurrection. However, if he goes that route, then Dillahunty gets rid of evidence not just for the resurrection, he'll get rid of all historical and testimonial evidence we rely on every day to be rational. This shows Matt's epistemology, or his theory of knowledge, is just wrong.
Evidence is being requested, but at the same time denied, where there's an insistence for a particular reductionistic type of evidence, namely scientific evidence. But at the very same time, if God were to come in a way that was observable or even repeatable, here you have Dawkins and Atkins saying that they would conclude that that was not in fact God, but that it was madness or hallucination or some other thing that is anything but the one thing that they don't want to be true, which is God. You can't both ask for evidence and reject evidence and be taken serious from an intellectual perspective in doing so. With that being said, thank you guys for watching this video. One last reminder to check out Fishing Clash. Use promo code WISDOM at checkout to get your goods there. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.